Happy 4th of July. I'll start by giving context and setting up the background of who was in the area before Pennsylvania was a colony. First up, there's the Lenape tribe, who lived around the area of New Jersey and East PA at the time Europeans first came here. The oldest history of the area that we know comes from the oral history of the Lenape. According to that, the tribe originally came from somewhere west of the Mississippi River. We don't know why. When they came, they encountered a tribe called the Allegheny. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. They talked to the leaders of the Allegheny and asked if they could settle around the same area. The Allegheny said, I don't want it to get too crowded around here. We'll let you pass through and go further east, though. So the Lenape did that. Or they tried to, and when they started moving, the Allegheny saw that there were a lot more Lenape than they thought there were. So they got nervous the Lenape would get greedy, and they attacked the traveling group of people. This started with a years-long war with thousands dead, and ended with the Allegheny getting chased away south. The Lenape never heard from them again. From the word Allegheny, we get the name of the Allegheny River, and apparently also the names of a few mountains and hills in PA. I don't know the names of mountains or hills in my area. There's also the 5 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. They were mostly in New York, but they also occupied parts of north-central PA. The rest of central PA was occupied by the Susquehannock tribe, who replaced a different tribe that used to live in the same area sometime around 1575. Probably, we think. And there was also the Erie tribe way out northwest. We don't know much about that tribe at all. I'll get to the reason why in a little bit. When Europeans first came, they found a group of people who had a good system of agriculture, a complex political and social structure, stone tools, fire, an abundance of food, and not much in the way of technology or what the Europeans called civilization. They found these people, few in number, probably only around 2,000 in the local area, living in a place that was very much an unbroken forest. Miles and miles of nothing but trees, rivers, streams, verdant and abundant with wildlife. During early years of settlement, the Lenape and other tribes related to the Lenape helped the Europeans more than once by giving them food when otherwise they would have starved to death. In the early 1600s, not many Europeans were in the area yet. The closest settlement to the north was the Dutch in what would later become New York, and the closest settlement to the south was the famous Jamestown colony. The first time a European interacted with a native of PA was actually John Smith of the Jamestown colony. Yes, the one from the Pocahontas movie. He came north to the Chesapeake Bay area to explore, so not in Pennsylvania yet. While he was there, the Susquehannock tribe sent people to meet him because they wanted to meet one of these white men that everyone was talking about. Shortly after his visit, there was Henry Hudson, the guy the Hudson Bay was named after. He didn't enter PA either, he was north of the Great Lakes even, but his exploration further inland in the continent inspired people at the Dutch East India Company to do some more exploring. Some of that exploring led them to what is now Delaware, and further up the river into PA. Some of these explorers were Cornelius Hendrickson in 1614, and David Peterson de Vries in 1631. As one might imply from the word company being present in the name Dutch East India Company, they were looking for something they could turn a profit on. In this case, that something was furs. On the Delaware, they built a wood fort called Fort Nassau in 1614. This was actually before New Amsterdam. This fort, sometimes left empty because they didn't always need people to be in there, was where they did business with the natives and traded for furs. One time in 1635, a group of people from Jamestown went up and captured the fort while it was empty. The Dutch laughed a hearty chortle, and they sent an armed warship down there to take it back and put those people on trial in Manhattan. They were later sent back to Jamestown. The Swedish monarchy in 1637 sent a group of people to start a colony on the Delaware, very near the place where Philadelphia is now. They did that, named the place Christina after their queen, traded with locals for furs and tobacco, started a farming community, built a Lutheran church, waited on supply ships from Sweden that took too long to come, appointed a 400-pound man as governor, and in general had a nice time of it, except for some disease in there. By 1647, they had 183 people, and by 1655, there are about 200 of them. The settlement lasts until 1655, in its current form at least. 1655 was when the Dutch at Manhattan said, "Look guys, I know our mother governments are supposed to be friendly, but we were down there first, and you've been annoying our little brothers over at Fort Nassau. So unless you can fight off 300 soldiers plus cannons and warships that we're sending down, we're just gonna take this land back. Toodles." As it happened, the 200 I mentioned included women and children. Basically, the folks at Christina had no hope of fighting off 300 soldiers. They surrendered, and the Dutch took over, and the people there had to swear loyalty to the Dutch within a year and a half, or else just leave. And where else were they going to go? Maryland to live with the English? They swore loyalty and stayed. Back to the tribes for a moment. Remember them selling furs and food to the Europeans? Ever wonder what they were getting back for that? Well, cloth and cooking utensils, pots and pans for a start, metal tools manufactured in Europe that the Native Americans hadn't seen yet. Among the more troublesome things they bought were guns and alcohol. First up, alcohol. Native Americans hadn't seen it before Europeans came. They loved it. A little too much. The tribal leaders noticed that everyone was becoming drunk all the time, and they said to the Dutch, "Hey, our people are drunk all the time. Would you mind not selling them the firewater anymore? Please and thanks." The Dutch thought this over and decided, yeah, these drunk Indians in our camp are getting a little annoying, doing all the bothersome things that excessively drunk people usually do in public, and started fining people if they caught them selling the Indians rum. This didn't stop it altogether, though, because sometimes people just needed to sell alcohol if they wanted to have enough food. As for guns, the whites were pretty interested in not letting the Indians have them, because the Dutch had a habit of stressful relations with local tribes wherever they went in the New World. Lots of effort was made to keep guns away from Indians on the Delaware, but apparently not in New York. It was New Amsterdam at the time. The Iroquois Confederacy ended up getting their hands on a bunch of them. Enough of them, in fact, that they were able to pay a visit to their old rivals, the Erie tribe, and gently remove their language and culture from existence. Yeah, that happened sometime around 1650, and Iroquois with guns made the Lenape to the south and the Mohicans to the north a little nervous. Over to Britain for a second. There's a civil war going on. This country will remain in a state of civil war until 1659. Back to the Delaware River settlement, now under control of the Dutch. The first record we have of a schoolmaster appears in 1657. Around the same time, cows start to be more prevalent. This is a pretty significant change because cows aren't native to North America. They had to be either packed away on a boat from Europe for 2 months, or bred from cows who were packed away on a boat from Europe for 2 months. Also, up in New York, the Dutch have been making bricks, so they could build buildings out of bricks, which are more sturdy and last longer than the material they were using before, mainly wood. The Delaware settlement got some of these bricks. As is characteristic of Dutch colonies in the New World, the Native Americans were not completely content. It started with someone accidentally getting killed by Indians for some stupid reason. Then the Europeans decided they needed to kill 1 or 2 Indians to teach them a lesson. Then the Indians decided they needed to kill 1 or 2 Europeans to teach them a lesson, and this went on and on for a few years. They still traded, though. Gotta have those furs. Enter Cecilius Calvert, the second Baron of Baltimore, who governed Maryland from 1632 to 1675. He wants land. He contacts the Dutch on the Delaware and says, "Hey, this is really no biggie, but we had explorers going through that land you took from the Swedish before you even knew it was there, so if you could just give us our land that we have a claim to, that would be Gucci." The Dutch are like, "Dude, were you even using this land? Why didn't you take it from the Swedish before we did? You say you have a claim to this land because one of your explorers was here 40 years ago, but I haven't seen you touch it since. We conquered it fair and square, so no, we're not handing it over." Calvert then stormed back to his own colony, slightly disgruntled, and did nothing. Somewhere off to the west, the Iroquois and the Susquehannocks are now at war. It looks like a stalemate. Hey look! The year is 1664. England figured itself out. As a consequence, they're ready to start wrestling for control of world trade again. So it's time for the Second Anglo-Dutch War. Creative name for that one. The war didn't actually start until 1665, but that didn't stop James, Duke of York, from gently claiming Manhattan and Delaware from the Dutch, much the same way the Dutch claimed Delaware from the Swedes about a decade or so earlier. Funny how that happens. In 1665, the Duke of York establishes a set of laws known as the Duke's Laws for New York, and by extension the Delaware Colony, which protect freedom of religion and guarantee trial by jury. Far away in Europe, William Penn Jr., the son of a decorated Navy admiral, is fighting for the English in the Second Anglo-Dutch War. After the war, he would live and study away from home and return, much to his followers' displeasure, having converted to a different sect of Christianity, something separate from the Church of England, Quakerism. A few years before the English took over, Parliament passed a law called the Navigation Act. This stated that colonies of England were not allowed to trade with anyone who was not from land controlled by the English. This particular rule didn't matter much to the Dutch and Swedes, who were living under the English flag, since the colony wasn't big enough yet to generate that much trade volume, especially not anything of a quantity that a ship not from the mother country would think twice about. The living under the English flag part must have bothered them, though, because some of the Swedes tried to stage an uprising in 1669. That didn't go well for them. By 1676, the Delaware Colony has a court system. By 1677, lots of people came into the New World from England. Most of them settled east of the Delaware River, in New Jersey, but some of them came west. By 1678, there were almost 500 Europeans living west of the Delaware. From this point on, Quakers, a minority Christian group in England, will start coming to the New World, the Delaware Colony in particular, because they want to get away from those hard-head Church of England people who never want to treat them with equal rights. The war between the Iroquois and the Susquehannocks is getting pretty messy. They've been fighting on and off for the past few decades, and usually nothing significant happens aside from killing each other's warriors. The Iroquois are winning this ongoing one, though. The colonists are worried about this affecting trade, so they organize a meeting in 1677 between the leaders of the two tribes, and they work out a peace agreement. The year is 1680. Remember that Penn guy who was in the English Navy? Well, his father, the admiral, is now dead. But before he died, he had a pretty impressive military service record, and he had lost part of his personal fortune in Ireland during the war. His son, the younger William Penn, took the opportunity and applied for a land grant in the New World as repayment to his late father's estate. Something west of the Delaware River and north of Maryland, as far north as plantable and as far west as the king is willing to give him. The grant was approved, kinda. The paperwork took almost a year. During the whole huge bureaucratic process, people who were not Penn and were not the king ended up naming the place. I imagine that conversation went something like this. A room full of people. They all look bored. A boardroom, if you will. One of them poses the question, what are we going to name this colony? A moment of silence. The first brave soul gives an answer. Well, the place is full of woods, right? Isn't the Latin word for woods Sylvania or something like that? Why don't we call it Sylvania? The room responds. They like the idea. The first bureaucrat responds. That's great, let's keep the ball rolling. Does anyone have any other ideas? A second brave soul pipes up. Well, the admiral whose estate we're giving this land to was named Penn, right? What if we call it Pennsylvania? The room responds. They like that idea even more. The first bureaucrat seems pleased, but he notices there's one person who hasn't given a response yet. What about you? Do you have any ideas? He sheepishly responds. What if we call it Delaware? You know, because it's on the Delaware River. Or we could call it New London. No? New Aberdeen? No, wait, what are you doing? Please stop! I joke, but that was their actual thought process in coming up with the name Pennsylvania. Anyway, Penn saw the name, and he wasn't too fond of it. He knew it was for his father and all, but he didn't feel great about the thought of people hundreds of years in the future thinking he named the colony after himself out of vanity. So, in early 1681, he went to talk to the king. The king's response was something along the lines of, "It's taken us 7 months to push all this paperwork through, I'm literally giving you control over an entire colony, and you're worried about the name. Don't push your luck, get your butt over there, and start governing Pennsylvania, Governor Penn." Penn mumbled a "yes, your majesty," and prepared to get his butt over to Pennsylvania and start governing. Penn, nearly 2 years later, finally arrived in the colony. He was 38 years old, and he had a wife and 2 kids now. He had sent a letter to the settlers in 1681, when he first officially got the grant, saying, among other things, "You are now fixed at the mercy of no governor that comes to make his fortune great. You shall be governed by laws of your own making, and live a free and, if you will, sober and industrious people. I shall not usurp the right of any or oppress his person." Now he was finally here. A system of government was set up consisting of an assembly with representatives from each county of the colony acting as a legislative branch, and a governor, Penn, acting as the chief executive. This would be a good government, one that had fair, lenient punishments for criminals, not the brutal punishments for petty theft that you saw in England. In fact, the only crime that should carry the death penalty should be premeditated, cold-blooded murder. The trials would be held publicly too. Above all, anyone who believed that Jesus was the Son of the one true God was free to practice any form of religion they pleased. That was the most important part. Great things would come from this place. 'Tis a good country. With a good conscience, it will do well. Quakers had a lot of reason to leave England and come to the New World, given that they were treated as second-class citizens across the pond. Penn made sure they knew that a religious safe haven was available over here. He also spread the word around the European mainland and attracted another religious sect from the Germanic regions, Mennonites, who were similarly mistreated like the Quakers and Puritans. Those people even set up something called the Frankfurt Company back in Europe, whose goal was to buy land from Penn and move Mennonites onto that land. Mennonites indeed moved into PA. The Mennonites are not to be confused with the Amish, however. Those are 2 different groups that came at 2 different times. Although there were a lot of Swedish and Dutch and German people, There were also a lot of English people, and the other cultures melted in, adopting English more than any other language to use on a daily basis. Penn talked boundaries with the Duke of York, up in New York Colony. He managed to get Newcastle and a 12-mile radius of land surrounding it, and he made sure that his colony got control of the river all the way to Delaware Bay, so they had better control and access to trade from it. He agreed to pay 5 shillings rent for this land to the Duke every year. The first General Assembly meeting happened in 1681, over a year before Penn arrived. They started making some laws. First off, Indians were to get fair treatment under the law. In fact, if anyone wronged an Indian, they would face the same legal penalty as if they had wronged a colonist. As far as land settlement goes, they wanted land to be put to use. If settlers go a certain number of years without planting crops on their land, the government would be allowed to settle a new family on that land who would plant it. They established rules for the assembly to operate by, as well as prerequisites for assembly members. They must be at least 21 years old, must confess belief in Jesus and God, and must own at least 100 acres of land. It was agreed on that people who derided others on the basis of religion should be looked on as disturbers of the peace, that taking the Lord's name in vain should be illegal, and nobody should do any work on the Sabbath day. Marriage required parental permission as well as an application to the state, and widows and widowers would not be allowed to remarry within a year of their spouse's death. Selling alcohol to Indians was still finable. Courts and appeals courts were also established, as well as public schools, and it was made a rule that all children must learn how to read and write by 12 years old. Finally, everyone who believed in Jesus Christ got freedom to worship however they want, or not to worship. Also, some place names got shuffled around. Upland, the Swedish name for the Swedish town, got changed to Chester, an English name. Also, the city of Philadelphia was named by William Penn himself, and it was decided that the city should occupy an area of 2 miles by 1 mile. The colony was in business. Remember that Calvert guy, Lord of Baltimore? Well, 1682 was a busy year. His son, the new Lord Baltimore, picks this year to pop up north and ask the Pennsylvanians about where his colony's northern border was. He had a piece of paper from 1632 signed by the king saying that the colony of Maryland extended to a part of the Delaware Bay laying under the 40th degree. He writes a letter to the people who seem to be in charge. He waits for a response, then gets fussy. He decides to personally make a trip north with 40 armed men and demand that someone negotiate with him where his border is. William Markham, the guy who was in charge until Penn's ship landed, got the job of talking to him. Markham essentially said, "Our governor isn't here yet, he'll be here soon, please take these nice-looking soldiers back down south and we'll let you know when he gets here." Baltimore essentially replied, "No." Markham said to him, "Look dude, my boss is sailing over, he'll get here soon, and if I try to negotiate with you, he'll be mad at me, and he'll be coming to bug you some more because any deal I make with you now will be illegitimate. I don't want a gunfight over some stupid 40th parallel. Please take your soldiers down south and William Penn will be around to deal with this when his ship lands." Baltimore still wasn't content. He asked Markham for a written and signed document stating that he refuses to cooperate in figuring out where the 40th parallel is. Markham provides the document, then Baltimore leaves in a huff eerily similar to that made by a 16-year-old being told they can't borrow the car this weekend. After Penn landed, he arranged a meeting with Baltimore. He traveled to Maryland in December. He showed Baltimore a brand new shiny piece of paper signed by the current king saying that, yes, the Delaware counties belong to Pennsylvania, the state does extend all the way to the Delaware Bay. Lord Baltimore replied, "But that's just a silly piece of paper. This is an official land grant. Besides, the king must not have known the geography of this place when he signed that. My grant says 40th parallel, which is north right about just above Philly, look at that. So, by rights, we should have Philadelphia." Penn replied, "That's ridiculous, and hey, doesn't your paper say below the 40th parallel, not up to the parallel? My land grant says I get the Delaware counties, so I get the bay, and you can still be below the 40th parallel." Needless to say, Penn left the meeting with no significant results, and each governor carried on with claims to large parts of the other's land. In fact, Baltimore even started charging taxes to people in the Delaware counties, and the Delaware counties got to send representatives to the Pennsylvania Assembly. One of the things Penn noticed after his arrival, in between dealing with Baltimore and looking after the Assembly, was that the colony had lots of healthy children. Almost every houseful, he writes, it is rare to find one without 3 or 4 boys and as many girls. Some 6 or 7 or 8 sons. Penn fit it into his schedule to also meet with the leaders of some local Indian tribes. The main purpose of most of his meetings with them this year was to buy land. He bought it fair and square. He didn't try to trick them like some tradesmen did, and he didn't take the land by force like some other colonial governments did. There's a famous painting that was commissioned decades later by one of his descendants showing his meeting with the Lenape tribe, but he also met with the Iroquois and the Susquehannocks. This fair treatment of the Indians would earn Penn a very good reputation among the local tribes. It would also earn some not-so-good attention from the New York colony up north. They were worried that all his deals with the natives would interfere with their trade with them. That, and they weren't so crazy about this whole Quakerism thing. Shouldn't those guys be following Church of England? The governor of Albany wrote back to the king in England and asked him to dispossess Penn of the colony. It was better back when New York controlled Pennsylvania. Of course, Maryland wasn't happy with Penn either, for border dispute reasons, as well as trade and religious reasons. In 1684, there was a witch trial. It was the only witch trial in Pennsylvania. 2 women were accused of doing witchy stuff to someone's cows. Their husbands each paid their bail, and they were set free. In 1695, Penn sailed back to England for 4 years and returned in 1699. Now, there's a rather persistent problem that started cropping up in the 1690s. You see, the thing about putting Quakers into a 17th century colony is this. They're pacifists. They don't fight. This greatly worried the non-Quaker half of the colony, considering they were a growing community bound to attract some kind of outside attention, and half of their population refused to touch a gun. They'd been controlled by 3 different nations in the past 40 years, after all. This colony thing was dangerous for more reasons than just natives. Christ Church in Philadelphia seemed to be the place where all the people who were worried about Quaker pacifism went to. Assembly members were chosen every October. Along with them, the county sent nominations for sheriffs and coroners that the assembly would vote to hire for 3-year terms. It decided that the estate of someone who committed suicide was to be passed down as if it were a natural death. And it was decided by the Quaker majority in the assembly that nobody should be allowed to compel someone to do anything that is against their religion. Such as, I don't know, serving in any kind of military, for example. Just an example. Penn left the state again a few years after his return and went back to live in England. From then on, anyone in the Penn family would be, well, pretty absent from the colony, only coming over every few years for vacation. Instead of properly serving their roles as governor, the governor position got passed down through the family, they would appoint lieutenant governors to live in PA and be the executive to the Assembly's legislative. The Assembly itself was out of session for most of the year, specifically in spring, summer, and fall. Why? Well, planting season. This was a farming colony. Everyone had a lot of land and a lot of crops to look after. Winter was the time when the Assembly members didn't have anything else to do. Most of the governors of the colony didn't do much exciting, but there's one in particular I will mention, John Evans, a Welshman who served from 1704 to 1709. This man was not a Quaker. He was also not pleased with the Quakers' pacifism, at all. He called for a militia multiple times, and was pretty much just ignored by the Assembly. He didn't stop there, though. At one point, he arranged for someone to ride through Philly on a horse yelling that the French were getting ready to attack the city, hoping to get some of the Quakers to pick up a gun. The result, the Quakers gathered in a church, and most of the other people ran into the woods to hide. Tough luck, Johnny. This same guy also had a fort built at Newcastle along the Delaware River, and tried to put a toll on the river. Pretty early in his term, one of the Assembly members tried to get him expelled by seeing he was too young to serve as governor. Evans, in turn, sued the man for slander. The population was growing. Religious groups were growing with them. Philadelphia had a growing Jewish population, so that was something. Also, a Roman Catholic church was built. People questioned whether it should be allowed because, well, it wasn't Protestant. But they left it up. In 1720, it was estimated that the white population in Pennsylvania had surpassed the Native American population, and in 1723, the colony officially started printing paper money. Our friend William Penn wouldn't live to see that, though. He died in July of 1718.